Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Tulsa World Opinion video podcast. I'm Jenny Graham, the editorials editor, and I'm here with Representative Monroe Nichols, and you represent Tulsa's 72nd district, correct?
That's right, House District 72.
Can you kind of remind people what those general boundaries are?
Sure. I have parts of North Tulsa, actually a little sliver of Owasso, but a big portion of North Tulsa. I got the Kendall Whittier area, so I have University of Tulsa, swoop back to the west, and I cut across downtown out to West Tulsa, the city limit. So a very diverse district. It's almost like a backwards L shape. So North Tulsa being up here and the city limit being over here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a fun district.
And you're also the chairman of the Black Legislative Caucus, correct?
That's right. Just became chairman last month. So less than a month into it, but really excited about the work ahead for the caucus.
Okay, well, that's why I'm having you on here, because during the session, there are things that y'all do down there that make us gnash our teeth a little bit. Yeah. And there was one piece of legislation that caught my attention, and it was House Bill 1397. And for background for people listening, this is a bill that was written by two white rural lawmakers, and I mention race because it is important in this context to know, to instruct the state education department to create a curriculum on the civil rights movement, particularly Martin Luther King, and to be available to middle and high school students. Now, I'm not a scholar of the civil rights. I just from being a reader and observer, but I'm reading that legislation and I saw problems with it. I'm interested in, when you saw the legislation, what were the problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And thank you for lifting this particular topic up. And I want to start by saying, I know at least the House author really, really well. He's a good man. But I think this is one of those areas where you have a blind spot because you don't understand the full context. And I think what was objectionable about it, there's a couple things, right? We live in a post-House Bill 1775 world, and both those folks supported House Bill 1775. And then we have a Black caucus with both Black senators and representatives that are in the legislature. None of us were talked to about this particular piece of civil rights, this elective course. And look, you don't have to talk to everybody before you do something or anything like that, right? I get that part. But if you want to talk about Black history and the civil rights movement, I think everybody in this country knows Martin Luther King's name. Doesn't mean you shouldn't learn more about Dr. King. You shouldn't learn more about the civil rights movement and nonviolent activism. But in this case, again, we mentioned, context is key. Why did Dr. King have to march? What's the historical context of what was going on in the country, and what does that mean for today, right? Because the goal with that kind of stuff is not just to think about history as like the stagnant thing of days gone by, but it's like, what do we learn? What can we glean from that today? And that conversation, because of 1775, because of the constant attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, is the part that kids can't get, right? That's the part you can't talk about in school. So, you do King, you do the civil rights movement, a great disservice if you talk about it only in the context of days gone by, not necessarily in how we can use those things in today's society. And the last thing I'll say about that is you take that part and we think about 2020. We think about here in Tulsa, we had folks marching because of police brutality, using the same types of tactics that Dr. King used in the 60s. We had an instance where a motorist, ran into some folks, and that person, I think it was legitimately fearful for what was going on. But what did we do as a legislature immediately after that? We ensured that folks like that had complete immunity, even though right now, if they felt like they were in danger, they were fine. That's what we learned from that lesson. What we learned is that we have to protect motorists on the street, not necessarily have any listen to at all what the folks are marching the street about. We didn't move any police reform in those years. We haven't done anything about that. And so teaching kids about Dr. King as an example only shows them that if you do all these things and you behave like this man who we all say is a great American, we're going to ignore you. And so, for me, I think that's kind of weird.
Well, when I read it, it was very, I mean, there's a law, and then they had a press release out. It's the peaceful side of Martin Luther King Jr. That stood out to me. The I Have a Dream version of Martin Luther King Jr. It's not the letter from a Birmingham jail, more angry, more critical, more complex. So it's this sort of peacemaker version that's preferred, not the complete version. And I also, by picking just him out of the civil rights movement, it ignores all the other people, that he wasn't alone. It wasn't just his movement. Right. And, I would imagine that, if they, Malcolm X is a pretty important part of that. Right. All these different people were influential, and it just leaves all that out. I don't know. It just sort of, and also that there's an end date to it, that it's from 1954 to 1968, and as if it's over, like it never, like nothing's continued on. Yeah, I mean, and it's what's interesting about that. It's like, till King was killed, it's like, oh, the story ends in death. Like, I mean, what? Not only is the story going, you mentioned some folks in history, but we here in Oklahoma have a rich history in the civil rights movement that kids here should absolutely be learning about. And I think you're right. Like, what was interesting when we were having the debate, the letter from Birmingham jail actually did come up. And when I was debating against this bill, I talked about one of King's, one of the things that he talked about in that letter, which was white moderates. And he talks about the folks who agree with where you want to go, but don't agree with your tactics and that type of stuff. And so you're right. Like, the I Have a Dream King is certainly King, and one of the most important speeches that we've ever heard in American history, civil rights movement or not. But he was a very complex character. I think kids need to understand that what we view of King, the guy who has a monument on the National Mall now, was not how he was viewed in the 60s, right? I think the goal is to teach young people that changing this country, changing this world, it's hard work. It's not, I'm going to do super popular work. The flowers that we give Dr. King today are flowers that he didn't live to be able to see, right? He was not necessarily the most celebrated person in the world then. And I think the watered down version, to your point, not only waters down the difficulty and the contributions of other people in the civil rights movement, but it also does water down who that person was. It also waters down what kids should learn about how do you do activism, how do you advocate, how do you mobilize to change things? Because honestly, I mean, I would love for folks to be like King. But I think before you be like King, you should know how difficult it was. I actually said when we were at the Capitol, that it would benefit everybody in this legislature to learn more about the civil rights movement, to learn about how do you listen to people and how do you work together. Because I guarantee you that's not not well-known stuff in the House of Representatives. For all of the pushback on DEI, some DEI information would avoid some of these problems. But you mentioned House Bill 1775, which is another law that dealt with race, that, it has to do with education. We don't want kids to feel bad. But in all of this, there's a Black Legislative Caucus. Does anyone come to the Black Legislative Caucus before these laws are made to say, hey, we're writing about race. What are your thoughts and concerns? Does anyone ever come to your caucus to ask about your lived experience in dealing with these laws and policies regarding race? No, not at all. And I mean, I would even go one step further. I'd venture a guess that not only do they not talk about the Black Caucus, I imagine they probably don't talk to any Black Oklahoman really about these issues, right? Like, this is, I think, what we've learned in history, and I think this is another great point about the civil rights movement, is one of the great motivators for voters is the issue of race, the quintessential us against them, the fear that somebody's going to replace you, the othering of other people, like that type of stuff. And this legislature is as guilty of it as anybody is. This governor's as guilty of it as anybody is. And so for that group to say, oh, we want to teach folks about the civil rights movement, it's like, hey, just want to let you know, you guys are way more Bull Connor than you are Martin Luther King, for the record. You are far more George Wallace than you are Martin Luther King. So the idea that you now are going to be trusted
with the legacy of these folks is completely unfair, because what you said is that we really don't agree with what they were fighting for. We want to talk about a romanticized version of what they accomplished. But at the end of the day, we are still the state that doesn't want to talk about things if it makes anybody uncomfortable. And I will tell you, it's not about anybody. It is about this idea that you might be making white people uncomfortable. I'll also say, I've never had a white student come to me and say I was uncomfortable about something I learned in school. This is about the fragility of grown people, not of students. Students don't feel guilty about stuff. There's not a student in America who thinks it's their fault that slavery happened. Like that legitimately doesn't happen. But what I think is coming to a head is this idea that this road toward equity means that we have a responsibility to do things different than we have before. And that's where the pushback is coming from, I believe.
Well, and the shutting out of the Black lawmakers really makes no sense to me when it comes to this. The whole point of the civil rights movement was to elevate Black voices, it was for equal rights. It was to bring Black Americans to the table. And yet they've excluded all the Black voices in this legislation and all legislation when it comes to race. And it does not, it's hypocritical to do that. And I don't understand why in this day and age, and I'm struggling with how white lawmakers can write about, a lived Black experience without talking to any Black people. I'm just
no, it is an interesting place we are in history. I would also say I think the civil rights movement was even bigger than just about like Black folks having equal voices. I mean, that's a part of it, but it really was about closing this gap between creed and deed. What the civil rights movement was all about is ensuring that the United States of America, as Dr. King said, was true to what it said it was on paper. And so if on paper it didn't say that we were equal, if on paper it didn't say those things, then okay, well, maybe we're not. But that's what the paper said. And so this is about making sure that we are as close to that as possible. I think to your point, though, the way that this legislature behaves shows that there clearly is no equality when it comes to that type of stuff. There's voices that are disproportionately white and conservative, and I know how elections work, so nobody has to quiz me on that. But we all are there essentially to work together. And when it comes to issues of race, and you do have a House Republican caucus and a House Senate caucus that is not diverse, you would think at least on these issues, you might come to George Young in Oklahoma City. You might come to Kevin Matthews in Tulsa, or Regina Goodwin, or Monroe Nichols. For no other reason than we deal all the time thinking about how do we come to terms with the race massacre. You would think that you would come to those legislators and say, hey, what do you think about this? Can we work together on this? And that essentially never happens. I'll tell you, we had a very difficult time years ago. This is a little bit off topic, but I think it's important in this context. We were going to have a resolution. So this is non-binding. It's just a resolution on the 100th anniversary of the race massacre that got hung up because there was a mere mention of reparations in there. And so the fact is that anytime we talk about race, we're talking about on the terms of white conservative legislators. However they want to talk about it is the only way we get to talk about it. And anything else is out of bounds. And they've made that true, not just in the conversation we had at the Capitol, but they've made it true in law with 1775. They've tried to make it true in law with this new piece of legislation on Dr. King. It's like, we talk about it on our terms. We don't want the input of folks who might have at least, I wouldn't even say a different perspective, but certainly a perspective that should be taken in. We may have agreed that, this is important to talk about with Dr. King. We may have said the civil rights movement ended in 1968. We may have said there's some changes. But I don't think any of us would have said an elective course on Dr. King is a horrible idea. I think our concern would have been about how you're going to teach it. And maybe we'd have had a lot of agreement down the road on it.
Well, and that's, I think a lot of people on the surface will say, this is a good thing. If people are coming out of school not knowing about Martin Luther King Jr., then we do have a big problem.
That's right.
So yes, I think we agree with that. But 1775 does get in the way, even I think with this legislation, because there's so many people that are reluctant to look at the inequities now.
Yeah.
That there's this thought, you've heard it too, we've had a Black president, so it's over, that there's this reluctance that something's happening now, that this is all history. And that's where this kind of legislation, while well-meaning, really doesn't prepare students for what they're going to face in what is the most diversified America ever. I mean, that's
right.
where I'm like, kids are maybe in a bubble now, but when they graduate, when they go off to college and in the workforce, we're not preparing them to have these conversations and to acknowledge inequities still exist in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the, I don't think that there was ever, frankly, a lot of conversation about this kind of stuff in high school. I know there's been overblown stuff about teacher training and that type of stuff. I'm not sure that schools are having deep conversations about diversity and inclusion. I think they should. The reason why I say that is because we all need help on getting our language right. We all need help on understanding different perspectives. I need that help, right? I think everybody needs that help. I have a cousin of mine who, when she graduated high school, she went to a majority minority high school, and then she went to Baylor University, and it was difficult for her because Baylor's, a predominantly white institution. So that was difficult. So, the whole idea about these conversations about diversity is not just about everybody understand what Black people and Hispanic people and Asian people are going through. It's not that at all. It's really we all trying to understand how we're going to live together. Like, we are all here at the same time. How we're going to live together, and it's important that we have those conversations to draw that out. It's okay to get it wrong from time to time. This happens to me often. We have a member of our caucus who's non-binary, and in a press conference, I used the wrong pronouns. I corrected myself, right? But it's okay to get wrong. This is all about learning about the world and the people around us and how we're gonna do all this stuff together. And anytime we take steps back where we decide, that's too difficult of a conversation for us to have, I do think we slip a little bit as a country. I don't know if you saw the NAEP scores that came out just the other day. I think students are 20 some odd % proficient in civics now, and I think 14% proficient in history. Watering down history ain't going to help that number, by the way. And that civics number means that we have folks who don't understand how our system works at all, which means we will continue to elect people. And I'm going to go ahead and say it, like the state superintendent, who's more concerned about race baiting than he is about educating kids. We're going to continue to give politicians the wrong type of incentive. And what I mean is to be like Ryan Walters and not necessarily go do your job, because what he understands is, one thing I'll say, he probably knows how to read a poll. And what polling information tells him is, even when you go to a school, go to talk to FFA kids, you slam Joe Biden and liberals, right? That's what the polling tells you. But is that really the responsibility of the state superintendent? So what we have because of those low numbers is we have this really grotesque incentive as politicians to do and say things that aren't going to move the ball forward.
Right. Well, and I just, you're right. Because I have teenagers, and so those kinds of conversations we're talking about, it's when they're older. And my son now, he got into college, and he said, I remember he came home and he was taking a history class. He goes, high schools really downplayed the effects of slavery.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, it took you to get into college to have those kind of conversations. So you're right. Some of those kinds of conversations are happening when they're older. Yeah. And it's more of a lived experience, as I say, being around people who are different and asking questions. And what's interesting is I found that the House Bill 1775 has really been used to be an anti-LGBTQ vehicle.
100%.
And so
the greatest impact
people worried about race, it's discrimination against others.
That's probably the greatest impact.
You mentioned Ryan Walters. So this is the one that gets me. It has instructed the education department, led by Ryan Walters, to create this civil rights curriculum. He has railed against everything DEI. He has slammed everything deemed woke. I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you, how confident are you in the Black Caucus that under Ryan Walters, an accurate civil rights curriculum could be created?
I think that was one of the biggest reservations that we had. In fact, there's a few Republicans I think ended up voting no because of that particular issue. I don't trust somebody who has used race baiting to, get his career going, to be a fair and accurate teller of the civil rights movement. I mean, part of me thinks he'd be a lot happier if it never happened. I'm very concerned about that. I'm also very concerned that we have a legislative body that frankly would give somebody like that kind of power. It's an additional slap in the face. So you don't talk to the Black Caucus about this. So we can think about ways in which we can, if we're going to have a curriculum, the boundaries around that curriculum, and ensure as best we can that if it goes to SDE, it'll be done well. So not only do you not talk to us about that, but you hand it over to somebody who has spent his entire time railing against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to me, I think DEI is the lasting legacy of the civil rights movement. And so we're going to give it to somebody who believes it shouldn't exist. I think that's a mistake.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, and I know we have a different setting. We had a little few, for those of you watching video, had some technical difficulties, which has me moving. But we did leave off talking about the Black Legislative Caucus. I wanted to find out what are the pieces of legislation, the issues and concerns that your caucus has been pushing in the last few years.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, pretty diverse pieces of legislation. I mean, we've had everything from affordable housing legislation that we've been working on for a really, really long time. Senator Matthews and I, Representative Goodwin has done a lot around police reform, but also criminal justice reform. Representative Turner has done a lot around criminal justice reform and obviously issues facing our LGBTQ community. Representative Lowe, he's an attorney by training. He's done a lot around criminal justice reform. And so what you see is pretty broad, a lot of job training stuff, a lot of Medicaid expansion type stuff in the past, those types of things. So we really are a caucus with a pretty diverse set of bills and pieces of legislation that we are pushing. I think chief among them is education. I think we understand the great equalizer education can be. And the reason why I mentioned it last is because all those other issues that I talked about, at the core of them is getting better outcomes for young people in their lifetime. We really believe as a caucus that economic mobility is really what we should be fighting for the folks who we care about the most. And I will say that's not just African Americans, but all Oklahomans who find themselves in a place to where this crippling generational poverty, this crippling of where systems has failed them, really believe that economic mobility is the way out of that. And so that's the reason why you'll see us fighting for education, job training, affordable housing, so on and so forth. And we're going to continue that fight.
So one of the things I've written a lot about, or it's almost an annual story, is the diversity on the composition on commissions, task force, boards, those kind of things. And at the state level, the diversity is not reflective of the state. But I would say the same thing with elected officials. The people in public service aren't reflective racially, ethnically of our population. What efforts, or maybe what challenges have there been in getting more people of color, getting more women, getting, diversity spans a large definition. What is being done to bring more people into elected office and public service?
Yeah, part of it is how we recruit candidates. But I will say, like 2 years ago, when Representative Bell was still in the legislature, the Black Caucus was as big as it's been in state history, which is a sign of progress. But I will say, if you look at Black legislators, Hispanic legislators, Asian legislators, not very many as a whole. And so part of it is certainly the candidate recruitment stuff. Part of it is how our elections are run, though. Right now, in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, we are a primary winner wins the general election. And the problem with that is not so much that those folks are going to tend to be Republican, but even within those Republicans, the push is always to be the most conservative in those primaries. There's not a lot of balance in the primaries, right? And because of that, the most conservative folks among us don't always celebrate diversity and things like that, whether you're a woman, whether you're a person of color, and that becomes really difficult. I think one of the great reforms we could make that might not even fully change the partisan makeup of the legislature is to have open primaries. I think that's going to lead to far more balance in the types of people we're electing. And when I say the types, like, again, I'm not saying just Democrat versus Republican, but I guarantee you elect more women in a cycle if you do that. You certainly elect more people of color in a cycle if you do that. I think you also moderate the legislature, which would still be, my guess is, center to right, but it'd be a lot closer to the center if we did that.
And I agree. And we've editorially supported that. And just to get more young people voting, get more people voting. So we've got like one of the next to last, I think, voting, or the last in voter turnout. But it's always hard because when you're the party in power, never wants to change it because they're in power. And that was the same when the Democrats had. I mean, Democrats had a chance to change that and they didn't. So I say it's both parties are at fault for where we're at.
100%. Yeah. It's more so if you got your hands on the power, how you want the rules to be made. So I don't begrudge Republicans for that necessarily. But what I would say is like, I don't think, my guess is even if we did that, Republicans would still certainly have the majority, right? Like they're not going to give up the majority.
Right. We're in Oklahoma. It's
right. 100%.
State. Right.
But what I will say is even the Republicans that are serving would have less pressure to have this hard bend to the right. I think they could stay closer to the center. And I think it would change our politics. It would certainly change the makeup of the legislature.
Well, we're at the end of the session. Any things you want to leave? What are we expecting in the last few weeks here? Is it going to be a flurry? I mean, right now we're in like the Senate and the governor, and everybody's in a standoff, which isn't serving anyone well. But what do you think is going to happen here in the next few weeks?
You know, we got a lot of vetoes to override, I think, is one of the things that we got to get done. We got to get a budget done. And I think, here's the troubling thing about what happens every year. And I know you've watched this for several years. It seems like we always end up in this place where it's either the Senate and the House aren't in line with the governor, or the governor is, with the Senate or the House, and they don't like the other chamber. And what we have is essentially, 3 or maybe 5 people who are having an ego contest and holding the rest of us hostage over something that, at the end of the day, is not as important, as dramatic as they're making it out to be. And so, we have this ego struggle in May every year. It happens no matter what. We've never gotten past it. We didn't have any money, we had that problem. Now that we got money, we have that problem. We're always going to have that problem. But I hope that we're able to make some headway. The House Democratic Caucus proposed some teacher pay raises that were double that of what the Republicans proposed. I think that's not just because we just like teachers so much, we're doing it for political reasons. I think every state in the country is in a race to keep teachers in the classroom and keep high quality teachers in the classroom. And they don't have a lot of incentive other than their love for kids and their passion for their job to be there right now. I think we should honor that now that we have the ability to do it. And we'll see to what degree that we get that done. I will say, to kind of wrap up our earlier conversation, I've always been taken by, the words of Chief Justice Warren at the memorial for President Kennedy after he was assassinated in November of 1963. And he said, the only thing we learn from history is that we never learn. I think he actually took that from a German philosopher. But I think that's important in the context of the conversation we had earlier about Dr. King. It's not good enough just to know that these things happen. It's how do we learn from them, right? Like I always say that today, our job is to learn as much about yesterday so that tomorrow can be a little bit better. And every day that we decide not to do that is a day that we risk falling back into the worst part of us, which we know we have the capacity to be. We can be that. We've been that. We can still be that. We also have this amazing capacity to be something different. And the great question for all of us is it door number 1 or door number 2? And I certainly hope that as we move through not just our role as legislators, but everybody listening to this podcast, who we are as Tulsans, who we are as Americans, really think about that. And we challenge each other and we challenge our elected leaders to be just a little bit better because we know we can look back in history and see how dark it's gotten, and it can get darker in the future, but we can control that. And I sure hope we take that power and choose a different pathway.
Well, I can't think of better words to end on. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. And I hope to have you on again soon. So I appreciate it.
Appreciate you. Take care.
Okay.